Think about the last time you donated to a cause.
Right.
Maybe you were at the grocery store checkout and, the cashier asks if you want to round up your total to help end childhood hunger.
Yeah, we've all been there.
You say yes, you hit the button on the keypad, and you immediately get that, warm, comforting glow. You did a good thing. You helped someone.
It feels great.
It does. But welcome to the deep dive. It is Wednesday, May 6th, 2026, and today we are asking a very uncomfortable question about that warm, fuzzy feeling.
Oh, yeah. It forces you to look in the mirror in a way most of us really prefer not to.
Because what if that flush of moral satisfaction is actually a massive red flag?
Yeah, that's the core of what we're looking at today.
Today we are unpacking this brilliant paradigm-shifting essay called The Thermodynamics of Charity by Elias Kunis. And our mission is to really dig into a multi-trillion-dollar puzzle.
Multi-trillion with a T.
Exactly. We're looking at why the entire business of, giving back might actually be optimizing for the exact opposite of what it claims to do, and how we can sort of reframe our understanding of what true help actually looks like.
It's a total perspective shift.
It really is. So let's just lay out some of the staggering statistics from the source here to set the stage. Since 1960, the developed world has transferred roughly $1.5 trillion in official development assistance to Africa.
Which is just a massive number.
And when you adjust that for inflation, we're looking at between 2 and 2.5 trillion in today's dollars.
So basically the GDP of a major global power, just handed over.
Right. But here's the crazy part. In many of these highly aid-dependent nations, poverty traps have actually deepened.
Yeah.
The governance is often no better, and in some cases it's actually worse than it was decades ago. But the charity sector itself, it just keeps growing.
Right, and to understand why that massive influx of capital didn't fix the problem, we have to borrow a concept from physics.
Okay, lay it on us.
We are looking at the clash between entropy and syntropy.
Entropy and syntropy.
Right. So entropy is the natural drift toward disorder, decay, and chaos. Think of a sandcastle slowly washing away in the tide.
Okay, makes sense.
Syntropy is the exact opposite. It's the creation of order, capability, complexity, and ultimately, independence.
Right.
So the overarching thesis from Kunis that we are exploring is that most charity actively creates entropy in the world, while genuinely believing it is creating syntropy.
Oh, wow.
And it does this because the system is designed to optimize for the donor's relief rather than the recipient's long-term capability.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we've established that just throwing $2 trillion at the problem isn't the fix. So we have to look at the motivations behind the money.
Exactly. It's all about motivation.
And when you look at why we give, the essay points out this massive conflict between two forces, sympathy and syntropy.
Right. Sympathy is an immediate emotional response. It's focused entirely on relieving distress right now.
Right, the immediate pain.
And crucially, it is about easing the donor's discomfort at having to witness someone else's suffering.
Ah.
If I see you hungry, I feel bad. If I give you a sandwich, I don't feel bad anymore.
So it's almost selfish in a way.
Well, it's neurological. Syntropy, on the other hand, isn't about my feelings at all. It is about building capacity. A syntropic intervention ensures that the recipient is more capable tomorrow than they were yesterday.
So they never need you to give them a sandwich again.
Exactly.
There's a really stark example from the essay of how these two forces clash in real time. Say a community is struggling and you decide to ship in tons of free food.
Right. Very common.
Yes, you relieve the immediate hunger today. That is sympathy in action. But let's look at the mechanism of what happens next. The local farmer in that community who relies on selling his crops to survive suddenly has no customers.
Because you cannot outcompete free.
Exactly. So that farmer goes bankrupt, he stops planting seeds, and next year there is zero local food production. So the hungry person is still hungry, but now the farmer is bankrupt and hungry too.
You have taken a functioning, albeit struggling, local system and converted it into a permanently dependent one. The sympathetic intervention felt amazing to the donor.
Oh, I'm sure it looked great in the annual report.
Exactly. But thermodynamically speaking, it was pure entropy. It literally destroyed order and capability in that region.
It's like taking a test for a struggling classmate.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
You relieve their stress today, and they might even hug you and thank you for it, but you absolutely guarantee they will fail the final exam.
Right. You optimize for the immediate relief of the pressure,
Yeah.
not their actual long-term capability
Yeah.
to master the material.
Exactly.
Which brings up a rather confronting reflection for you, the listener. The essay challenges you to really audit your own giving. Ask yourself this: would you still do the charitable act if it provided you with zero psychological payoff?
Like you felt absolutely nothing.
Right, you felt nothing and absolutely no one ever knew you did it. Would you still do it?
Man, that is a brutally high bar. I think most people would quietly back away from that deal.
Yeah, they would.
But if sympathetic charity often destroys capability, why does the sector just keep expanding year after year? It seems like it defies the laws of economics.
It defies traditional market economics, sure, but it perfectly follows the psychology of the donor class.
How so?
Because the act of giving is often completely disconnected from the actual outcome. First, you have guilt laundering.
Guilt laundering.
Right. A lot of high net worth individuals or corporations benefit from highly unequal economic systems. A massive charitable donation acts as, like, moral absolution. It's essentially purchasing a societal hall pass.
Like buying carbon offsets for the soul.
Exactly. And then you have the purely neurological warm fuzzies we talked about. The human brain rewards the physical act of giving right at the moment you write the check or click donate.
You get a dopamine hit right then and there.
Right.
Yeah.
And that chemical reward is completely divorced from what happens with that money 3 years later, halfway across the globe.
That makes so much sense.
And we cannot ignore status signaling. In our modern framework, visible sacrifice confers massive social status. And to get that status, the sacrifice doesn't actually have to be effective. It just has to be highly visible.
Right.
But the most critical piece of this puzzle, the real engine driving this, is what the author calls the inverted feedback loop.
Okay, yes. Let's talk about how this loop actually functions. Because in a normal business or in nature, failure kills the organism.
Right?
If a restaurant makes terrible food, people start buying it, the restaurant goes bankrupt, and the bad food is removed from the market.
The feedback loop works.
Exactly. But in the charity sector, failure is actively rewarded.
It is.
If an NGO fails to solve poverty in a region, they don't go out of business. They take photographs of the worsening poverty, they put them in a glossy brochure, and they use them to raise even more funds.
The worse the problem gets, the more their budget increases.
Which is just wild to think about.
But what's fascinating here is that it's just system physics at work. Every organization, whether it's a corporation or a nonprofit, subconsciously optimizes for its own continuation.
Right.
To ensure its own survival, an NGO must ensure that the problem it was built to solve persists at a manageable level. Genuine success actually solving the problem and making themselves obsolete would mean laying off their entire staff.
Okay, I have to push back on that a little bit
Sure.
because surely they aren't trying to fail, right? I know people who work in the nonprofit sector. They are incredibly dedicated, passionate people. They aren't sitting in a boardroom twisting their mustaches, actively scheming to keep people poor just to protect their jobs.
Oh, you're entirely right.
Yeah.
And that is the most insidious part of this dynamic. It isn't a malicious conspiracy. It doesn't require evil people.
Yeah.
Good, well-intentioned people get trapped in broken systems. When a system lacks a feedback loop tied to long-term capability, the organization will naturally drift toward metrics it can control.
Like number of meals served or dollars raised.
Exactly, rather than number of people who no longer need our help.
So what happens when these broken, well-intentioned feedback loops collide with actual real-world economies on a macro level?
Well, it leads to massive structural damage, often referred to as the foreign aid trap.
The foreign aid trap.
Right. When a high-energy system like the West dumps massive amounts of free resources into a low-energy system without integrating into the local economy, it crushes domestic production.
There's a perfect example of this in the essay with what happened to the African apparel market.
Oh, the textile trap.
Yeah. Every year, people in the West donate millions of tons of used clothes to charity bins. The intention is purely sympathetic, clothe people who need it.
Right.
But there was a fascinating 2008 study by an economist named Garth Fraser that looked at the actual impact on the ground. The result of flooding the market with free clothes was a 40% decline in African apparel production
40%.
and a 50% drop in employment in that specific sector.
Think about the mechanism there. A local tailor needs to sell a shirt for $5 to buy groceries for his family. A shipping container arrives filled with free, donated shirts.
The local tailor instantly goes out of business.
Exactly. The donation destroyed a functioning economic sector and created a class of people who now depend entirely on the next shipping container.
And then there is the governance trap, which might actually be worse because it corrupts the political immune system of a country.
Yeah. Let's look at how a healthy state functions. A government must tax its citizens to build roads and fund its military
Right.
because it needs the citizens' money. A feedback loop of accountability forms. If the government doesn't provide services, the citizens riot or vote them out.
Makes sense.
But when a government receives its primary funding from foreign aid, that loop shatters. The government doesn't need to tax its people anymore. It only has to answer to the foreign donors in London or Washington.
It completely insulates the rulers from the ruled.
Exactly.
But look, I want to be fair here. We have to impartially report the counter-thesis too. Aid isn't universally a disaster. There are historical examples where it has actually worked.
For sure.
Between 1953 and 1960, South Korea was heavily dependent on aid. They used foreign development assistance for roughly 80% of their core infrastructure, things like factories, roads, shipyards. And today, South Korea is an economic powerhouse.
It is a great counterexample, but you have to look at how they used it. South Korea had a developmental state with incredibly strict, unyielding domestic ownership of its industrial strategy.
So they were in control.
Right. They weren't just passively accepting shipments of free food and clothes. They took the capital and directed it entirely toward building structural centrifuge factories and education. They forced the aid to serve their long-term capability.
That's a huge distinction.
And, while we are talking about aid mechanics, we need to dispel a persistent myth. People often claim that 20% or more of all aid is just stolen by corrupt dictators.
Right, you hear that zombie statistic all the time. But the text points out that when economists actually track the money siphoned off into offshore bank accounts in highly aid-dependent states, the leakage rate is much closer to 7.5%.
Right.
Which is still bad, obviously. But it tells us that the primary failure of aid isn't just outright theft. The failure is the structural entropy it creates, even when the money goes exactly where it was supposed to go.
Exactly. Which brings us to the one massive, undeniable success story in global intervention, PEPFAR.
The U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief.
Right. It has saved roughly 25 to 26 million lives since 2003.
So if the system is so broken, why did PEPFAR succeed?
Because it was designed as what we call a vertical intervention.
A vertical intervention?
Yeah, they didn't try to go in and fix the sprawling, dysfunctional local ministries of health. They didn't try to build a horizontal healthcare system.
I bypassed all that.
Exactly. They just set up parallel supply chains and delivered specific, tangible goods, antiretroviral drugs, directly to the patients. They bypassed the entropy of the political systems entirely.
Which highlights a really stark reality. Outsiders can successfully parachute in and deliver a tangible good, like medicine or a water filter.
Yeah.
But outsiders cannot successfully engineer a political system, rebuild a culture, or force good governance from the top down.
Never. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the physics of entropy simply do not allow it.
Right. Now, we've spent a lot of time looking at this on a global stage, but these thermodynamic rules don't suddenly stop working when you cross the border back home.
No, they definitely don't.
We see this exact same pathology operating domestically, right in our own backyards, particularly with what we can call the domestic charity industrial complex.
It is a massive issue.
Yeah.
Think about tax-exempt foundations. They operate as vast pools of zombie capital.
Okay, let me argue in favor of endowments for a second, though. Isn't the entire point of a foundation to be insulated from market pressures?
Go on.
Like, if you want to cure a complex disease, you might need a 20-year research horizon. A public corporation trying to hit its quarterly earnings targets won't fund that. But an insulated endowment can. Doesn't that zombie capital serve a vital purpose?
In theory, absolutely. Insulation allows for long-term thinking. But in practice, when you completely remove both the market discipline of profit and loss and the democratic discipline of voters, you remove all the feedback loops.
Right.
Without the threat of going broke, these foundations naturally drift. They stop optimizing for the cure, and they start optimizing for their own administrative bloat. They become perpetual jobs programs for the credentialed class.
There are some wild case studies in the essay on how this plays out, and I need to give a quick, impartial reporting directive. Here we are neutrally reporting the author's specific examples without taking any political sides.
Right, just looking at the mechanics.
Exactly. So take the environmental movement. For decades, major NGOs poured incredible amounts of funding into blocking nuclear power expansion across the West.
Yeah.
Look at the real-world mechanism of that in Germany compared to France. In Germany, the NGO pressure worked. They shut down their nuclear plants. But they still needed electricity, so they had to replace that baseline power with coal and imported gas.
Right.
Today, Germany's power grid emits roughly 380 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour.
And compare that to France, which essentially ignored those same NGOs,
Yeah.
kept its nuclear fleet online, and emits only about 56 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour.
That is a massive difference.
It is. The donors who wrote checks to those anti-nuclear NGOs genuinely believed they were saving the planet.
But the actual mechanism of their donation funded a massive increase in carbon emissions. The intervention was entirely entropic.
You see this dynamic in social policy, too. There is a very candid, almost painful insider testimony in the piece from Nicole Shanahan, the former wife of Google co-founder Sergey Brin.
Right.
She personally directed hundreds of millions of dollars in philanthropy.
Yeah, she poured money into criminal justice reform and community safety initiatives. But instead of improving, she watched every single metric get worse. Crime went up. Mental health crises deepened.
And the mechanism of why this happened is chilling.
It really is. The NGOs she funded were running awareness campaigns and actively dismantling existing enforcement structures, but they weren't building any viable, functional alternatives to keep the community safe.
They created a vacuum.
And when the community naturally deteriorated, those same NGOs pointed to the worsening poverty and crime to justify why they needed even bigger grants next year.
She eventually realized the NGOs essentially needed the communities to remain broken. She walked away from it all and concluded, I've created a monster.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it is absolutely terrifying that idealists with practically unlimited budgets can inadvertently fund entropy at scale simply because they don't have a functional feedback loop telling them they're causing damage.
Which forces us to ask the most important question of this entire deep dive. If both the global charity models and the domestic foundation frameworks are fundamentally broken, how do we actually help people?
Right, and the essay argues that the highest syntropy moves you can make are often not classified as charity at all. There are things like investment, trade, or simply building your own capability to its absolute maximum.
Exactly.
Think about a brilliant biologist. The biologist who locks themselves in a lab for a decade and figures out how to cure a form of cancer does vastly more for the future of humanity than if they had, felt guilty about their privilege and spent that decade volunteering at a local soup kitchen.
It sounds cold because it violates our traditional moral intuition that sacrifice equals goodness.
Right.
But building capability is far more valuable than performing sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the most centropic thing you can do is literally nothing.
The controlled burn. I love this concept.
Yes, the controlled burn.
Yeah.
Think of forest management. If you artificially suppress every single small fire out of sympathy for the trees, dead brush builds up on the forest floor.
Right.
Eventually, a spark catches, and you get a catastrophic, unstoppable mega-fire that destroys the entire ecosystem.
So by constantly propping up a failing system, whether it is a bad business, a corrupt government, or a toxic dynamic, you are masking the dysfunction.
Exactly.
Allowing the failure to happen respects the information content of that failure. The pain of the failure is the signal that forces the system to actually adapt and correct itself.
Now, some people point to the effective altruism movement, or EA, as the solution here.
Right. EA is huge right now.
And EA is certainly a step up from traditional charity because it demands evidence. It optimizes for measurable outcomes over the donor's feelings.
What?
But it is still dangerously incomplete. It operates on a charity framework that systematically underweights the importance of building direct, localized capability.
Right. To understand why it fails, we have to look at the massive difference between local and global charity.
This is a crucial distinction.
Local charity actually works. When you help your neighbor rebuild their barn after a storm, there is direct verification and reciprocity. You see them get back on their feet.
And if they use your money to buy alcohol instead of lumber, you know instantly, and you stop helping.
The social fabric of the local village enforces accountability.
But when you try to scale that dynamic globally, the mechanisms snap. You cannot verify outcomes at a distance of 5,000 miles. You just get a glossy report.
Which goes back to the inverted feedback loop.
Exactly. Now, global coordination, like international treaties on climate change or planetary defense against asteroids, is a different category. That is mutual agreement on rules. But scaling local, one-way charity to a global level actively creates entropy because it destroys the feedback loop of reciprocity.
Okay, let's make this highly practical for the listener. How do we avoid falling into the trap? How do we filter out the entropy?
You apply what the author calls the aliveness test.
The aliveness test.
Yes. These are 5 filtering questions you must ask before intervening in any system. Let's walk through them. Number 1, is it actually centropic? Does it measurably increase capability?
Right. So dumping free clothes in Africa fails this immediately because it destroyed the local tailor's capability to make clothes.
Exactly. Question 2, does this intervention increase capability or does it increase dependency?
Feeding the hungry man but bankrupting the local farmer increases dependency, so that fails too.
Question 3, is there a feedback loop to outcomes? Will you actually learn if your intervention worked or failed?
And this is the zombie capital problem. If your foundation will just keep existing and paying its board members regardless of whether the community gets better or worse, you have no feedback loop.
Spot on. Question 4, does this maintain or remove selection pressure? Does it act like a controlled burn, or are you just delaying a catastrophic megafire?
Right.
And finally, question 5, the most important one. Am I optimizing for true syntropy, or am I just optimizing for my own feelings?
So what does this all mean for us? When you synthesize all of this, the takeaway is that true help is actually quite cold.
It is.
It doesn't look like a heartwarming commercial with sad music. True help demands rigorous accountability rather than just accepting a sad story. It accepts that some systems have to hit rock bottom and fail before they can gather the information needed to improve.
Right.
And most importantly, it measures success by the recipient's absolute independence, not by the donor's emotional satisfaction.
As we wrap up today, your baseline assumption moving forward should be that any outside intervention is entropic until proven otherwise.
Right.
The burden of proof is always on the intervention.
Every day we are faced with the choice between feeling helpful and actually being helpful. And the thermodynamics of charity make a devastatingly clear case that those two things are rarely the same.
I challenge everyone listening to audit their own giving and their own interventions in the lives of the people around them. Ask yourself the hard question. Am I optimizing for my own comfort, or am I truly increasing the capability of the future?
That is the perfect question to end on. But to close out our deep dive today, I want to leave you with a brand new thought experiment that builds on what we've discussed.
Oh, I like where this is going.
If the root of the problem is that global charity lacks the direct verification and reciprocity of a local village, what happens when emerging technologies like AI and decentralized blockchain networks finally allow us to track the exact hyperlocal impact of a single dollar all the way down to the individual recipient across the globe?
Wow.
Will technology eventually allow us to engineer a global charity system that actually functions with the rigorous, immediate accountability of a small town? Something to think about.